You don't have to be a religious person. You don't have to believe in God to understand that human life begins at conception, and that human life is no different than what our lives were when we were in the womb. And again, it's about rehumanizing that person in the womb. Any person is, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know human development and where we come from. And so it's just basic knowledge at this point.
We heard in part one from Ramona Trevino in an exclusive one-on-one interview where she shared how the Lord really showed her the true spiritual nature of those who are gung-ho advocates for abortion and institutions behind them like Planned Parenthood. She also briefly touched upon her experience working at Planned Parenthood. But now we hear Ramona's full story about how the Lord led her from her work at Planned Parenthood to her work now at 40 Days for Life, and really how the Lord led her from her guilt to His grace.
So I really thought that my pro-life story began when I left Planned Parenthood. But now I recognize that my pro-life story really started from the day I was in my mother's womb, right? But it really started when I became pregnant at 16. I am from a little rural town northeast of Dallas. And so I always joke and say that's why you see a brown face with a very country accent. So I'm from this little rural town, less than 700 people. Everybody knows everybody. And so when I became pregnant, you can imagine the scandal. I scandalized everybody because I went to school pregnant. And I was the very first girl in our town to go to school pregnant. But it was interesting. I always say it was such a grace from God, because when my pregnancy test showed positive, I instinctively knew that I was a mother. At 16 years old, I didn't have to have anyone tell me that it was possibly a baby or, all of these things. I knew that what was in my womb was not a what, but a who. And it was my child. Sadly, the father of my daughter didn't want me to have the baby. He wanted me to have an abortion. And because I kept her, I always say it kind of, led to his resentment towards me. And so I was in a very abusive relationship for 8 years and experienced a lot of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, all of those things. Until God really gave me the courage to walk away from that and face my life as a single mother and accept it, because I knew that at the end of the day, God didn't want that for me, and I had to trust Him in that moment that something better was for me, even if it meant being alone. So I took that leap of faith and I walked out of that relationship, and little did I know that God had something else planned for me. And a couple of years later, I would meet my now husband of 16 years. A few years after we were married, we had our first baby together. He had a daughter, I had a daughter, we had a blended family and had our first son. And just a few years, I think it was maybe like a year and a half later after we had our son, I was approached by an ex-employee of my coworker who had offered me this opportunity to work for Planned Parenthood. And I was not familiar with who Planned Parenthood was. The only thing I knew about Planned Parenthood, and this can be said for a lot of people in our country, I just thought Planned Parenthood offered affordable health care to women. And that's all I knew. Being in a little country town, I didn't even know where women went to get abortions. I just didn't think that it was something that was, now we know, 70 million babies. But I really believed the whole safe, legal, and rare. And so I really justified working for Planned Parenthood because it wasn't happening under my roof, and somehow I believed that I was preventing abortions, because I had bought into that lie as well, that hey, birth control prevents abortions. And so I began my work at Planned Parenthood, accepted this position as the clinic director, and I really, to be honest, I think what was most attractive was the opportunity. There was an opportunity for me to prove myself, to prove that I had these gifts and these talents to run this clinic. And so I went into Planned Parenthood under the idea that, okay, I personally don't agree with abortion. How many of us have heard that from people? I personally don't believe in abortion, but I'm not going to tell another woman what to do with her body. Show of hands? Yes. And that's the issue, right? And so I was under that same, idea of I wouldn't personally do it. I personally don't agree with it, but it's a woman's right to choose what she does, right? And so accepting that position, I really thought that I was going to help. I thought I was going to help underinsured women. I thought I was going to help poor women. I thought I was going to help prevent abortion. And I thought that I was going to be separate from the abortion side of the business. Until my very first abortion referral. I had only been there probably a week or two when a young woman came in. She was a college student. And she came in with the father of her baby, her boyfriend. And no one was there. And I take that back. I think everyone had gone to lunch. And I just said, you know what, you go ahead and have your lunch. I'm going to take her back and, do the pregnancy test. And so I walked her back into the clinic. I got her urine sample, sat her in the exam room, and I came back into the room and I said what normal people say to women when they're pregnant. I said, congratulations, you're pregnant. And she immediately burst into tears. And I had failed to see that on the intake form, she had chosen abortion as the option she wanted information on. There was an intake form that we gave all of the women who wanted pregnancy tests. As soon as they walked in, at the very bottom it said, if your pregnancy test is positive today, what type of referral would you like? And it says abortion, adoption, or prenatal. So it already gets them thinking about it before they even take the tests, right? And so she had marked abortion, and I thought, oh man, I just messed up. How am I gonna, backtrack out of this, right? Because I just congratulated her on her baby, and she doesn't want this baby. I turned to God and I said, Lord, please help me out of this. Basically, I just I don't remember exactly what I told her, but I was trying to find a way to say it in the right way where I wasn't complicit in her choice. And so she walked out of my office, walked out of the exam room, out of the clinic in tears as I gave her, her referral for the abortion. And I walked back into my manager's office, and the strangest reaction is that I closed the door behind me and I began to cry. And in that moment, I could not tell you why I was crying. I was even asking myself, Ramona, why are you crying? And I couldn't put my finger on it in that moment. Of course, now I recognized that at that moment, I felt like I had sold my soul to the devil. That I had compromised everything that I personally believed for the sake of choice. For a paycheck, for a position, for opportunity. I was looking out for myself. And I didn't consider the implications. I didn't consider what I was doing. And so in that moment, I always say it was like I was Pontius Pilate and I just washed my hands of the innocent blood that was going to be shed. And for me, it was necessary to just put that behind me, to suppress it, to suppress those feelings so that I could continue with my position at Planned Parenthood. Because if I had accepted it and recognized it, as you can imagine, you can't stay, right? But I needed my job, and I wanted my job. And I had something to prove, not just to myself, but to the world. That Ramona wasn't just some teen mom who had, dropped out of high school and failed, in life, so to speak. I was an honor student. And everyone at school thought I was going places, right? And so when I became pregnant as a teen, they all said Ramona has ruined her life, right? And so I felt like I had something to prove to the world. So I stayed there. And I allowed myself to compromise everything that I knew to be true, which is the baby in the womb is human from the moment of conception. And I knew that even as a teen mother. And yet here I was compromising that and allowing these women to exercise their so-called right to choose. So as years go by, I began to witness all of these things that would be very troubling to me. Again, I didn't witness the abortion side of the business. I was spared, thank God, from that side. But I did witness other things that were just as troubling. And one of those things, we're seeing young girls as young as 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 years old coming in for contraception without parental consent, because under Title 10, you don't need parental consent to walk into any Planned Parenthood in any part of the country and ask for birth control and get on birth control. It's crazy, right? Because we can't even, the schools don't even, they're not even allowed to give our kids Tylenol without parental consent. But yet, we can give teenagers birth control without mom and dad knowing, right? And so I was seeing these young girls who were so young, not only getting on birth control, but who were living a life of promiscuity at such a young age. And you would think, Ramona, you were 16 and pregnant. You shouldn't be so shocked, right? But I was shocked. I was genuinely shocked by that. You know, at 14 years old, there's no reason you should have 2 or 3 sexual partners in a span of 1 year, right? And here we were, putting them on contraception and sending them out to God only knows what and with who. We weren't looking out for their dignity. We weren't teaching them abstinence or chastity or any of those things that we know would bring true dignity to these young ladies. And I later started to realize, of course, after, that we were just preparing and grooming and producing new future abortion clients. Because Planned Parenthood was really good on making sure that if a kid came in with their parents, the mom had to stay in the lobby. We wouldn't allow the mother to come back with the young girl, because now we were the authority. We were the ones we wanted their trust, so that in the event they do become pregnant, who do they come back to? They come back to Planned Parenthood, because we're the voice of reason. We're the ones who can tell them, okay, this is probably the best option for you. And I witnessed that. I witnessed moms bringing in their daughters who were pregnant, who even the mothers were like, it's kind of her decision, and leaving it up to their daughter to abort their own grandchild. And so you see these things, right? And you see these young girls who are coming in with STD infections repeatedly. I remember one young lady, she was probably about 17 years old, and she kept coming in with chlamydia over and over from the same guy. And there was no one to sit down and say, you deserve better than this, right? But rather, she was a dollar sign. We treat her, we make money. We put her on birth control, we make money, right? And so I was watching this day in and day out, right? Producing these new future abortion clients. And then there was the misuse of Medicaid money, our tax dollars, right? The misuse of that by putting, like for example, we would have a young woman who would come in who would get, on hormonal birth control pills. And if she was on Medicaid, we would sell all 12 months of pills. You don't do that at the pharmacy. You have to go 1 month at a time, right? But we would sell all of it, and then we would put it in our quota for the month. And then she would come in a few months later and decide, you know what, the pill's not working for me, so I want the injection, the Depo-Provera, or an IUD, or whatever method she wanted to change over to. So there again, you're double dipping into Medicaid, and you're selling that to Medicaid. And that's our tax dollars, right? Then you have the situation that we had, I'll never forget, this Plan B competition. It's a competition. We had a backstock of Plan B, the emergency contraception, that was about to expire. So we weren't selling it enough. And it was about to expire. So they sent out a memo to all the clinic managers, and they wanted us to push Plan B onto women. Sell Plan B to as many women as we could. And then if they were on Medicaid, sell them too. Right? And knowing that it was going to expire. And the winner, the clinic that sold the most Plan B, everyone got $50 Visa gift cards. So I was like a drug dealer, trying to convince women to take this Plan B, and I was trying to figure out creative ways to convince these women, you need a Plan B. Why on earth would a woman want Plan B in her medicine cabinet, right? It's an emergency contraception. And yet, think about it. If the day came that she needed this and she had it in her medicine cabinet, it was expired, right? And we know that expired medication, you can still take it, but it's less effective, right? Well, great for Planned Parenthood, because if it fails, abortion. And so all of these things, I saw this day in and day out, all of these red flags, right? And yet I still continue to justify my position by the 1 or 2 good things that happened. We always hear about, Planned Parenthood provides mammograms. No, they don't. They don't provide mammograms. They refer to a third party. And so every now and then we'd have women that would send little cards and say, thank you so much for, the mammogram because it detected something, and, I don't know what I would do without you. And I'm thinking, oh, see, we do good things. But at the end of the day, it wasn't Planned Parenthood. And so I really needed to justify and find a little glimmer of hope, right? This little sliver of something that allowed me to continue to stay there and rationalize and forget about all the bad stuff. Let me focus on the good stuff, right? So what happened? What led me to this conversion, right? So it was one evening, I was a little frustrated at work because they wanted to train the clinic managers on how to draw blood and give Depo-Provera shots. And the reason they wanted us to do that was because they wanted to be able to pack our schedule and make things more efficient so we could get more women in and get more women out. So hey, let's train the directors, the clinic directors, on how to draw blood and give shots, right? And I was bothered by that because I hadn't signed up to be a medical assistant. I didn't go to school to be, and if anybody's in the medical field, you know what can go wrong. That's why people go to phlebotomy school, right? Because they have to learn. And I can tell you, Planned Parenthood's idea of training is just a few days of this and that, and then you're done, right? It's nothing official. And I was bothered by that because I was thinking of all the things that could go wrong, not just with the patients, but even with me. I could stick myself, and there's all these other issues, right? And so I was bothered by that, a little frustrated, and I left work that evening. It was December of 2010 when I left work that evening, and I started driving around the local Walmart looking for a parking spot. So I was driving for a little while, as you can imagine. And so I finally found a spot, but as I was driving, I was flipping through the radio station, and I just kept changing the station. And it was kind of weird, it was looking back at it, I think that's how strange. I was flipping and flipping and flipping. I just looking for something. I don't know what I was looking for. And then I flipped over to the AM station, and that's how you know it's the Holy Spirit, because I don't know about you, how many people flip over to the AM station? So I flipped over to the AM station, and immediately I landed on our local 9:10 AM Radio Guadalupe, Catholic radio. And I stopped. And I heard the words Catholic radio. And I went, Catholic radio? I've never heard of Catholic radio. I've been Catholic my whole life. I've never heard of Catholic radio. So I stopped and I started to listen. One guess on what they were talking about. Just one guess. Abortion. So I'm assuming, I wish I could go back and figure out what programming, but I'm thinking it was open lines. Because they had women calling in the first segment who had had an abortion in their past. And there was a couple of things that struck me with those women who were calling in. One thing was that these women were speaking about their past experiences at a Planned Parenthood. And what struck me was not just their courage and their willingness to call, or they were anonymous, but they were willing to share something so dark and deep and private and get that off their chest and tell their experiences. And so the other thing that struck me was how they described their experiences at the abortion facilities. And they all had this one commonality, which was they felt like cattle being moved in and moved out very quickly. And they all said they felt like they were just a number, and that no one ever really stopped and talked to them or counseled them. It was always just trying to get them in and out. And I began to see this parallel with their stories and what we were doing. Even though we weren't performing abortions, I noticed this parallel that, hey, we're doing the same thing. And I kept trying to convince myself, we're different though, because we don't do abortions. Here I was trying to justify. But it stuck with me. Now the second part of that segment was something a little more challenging. It can be a little challenging for people to hear this. It was definitely challenging for me. It was about contraception. And it was the first time I'd ever heard the word abortifacient. I was using birth control pills during that time, and I had been using contraception for many years because I had suffered from endometriosis for so long, and my doctor, not being pro-life, used contraception as a Band-Aid. I didn't know there were other alternatives. And so I was using contraception during the time that I heard this, and I heard the term abortifacient. I never heard it. And for anyone who doesn't know, it just means that hormonal contraception has the potential to abort a very early baby, like early. Because contraception works in 3 different ways. 1, it prevents ovulation. And number 2, it thickens cervical mucus to help prevent the sperm from reaching the egg. And then if all that fails and there is a breakthrough ovulation, which we know happens because we hear stories of women who became pregnant on birth control. And so if there's breakthrough ovulation, the 3rd method is the abortifacient method, which means that it has thinned out the uterine lining so that if there is fertilization and there is a new life there, it cannot implant. It will have a difficult time implanting in the uterus. And I didn't believe it. I thought, this priest is out of his mind. This can't be true. It's impossible. Because if this is true, then it's probable that I could have aborted my own children through chemical means and not know it. If this is true, then I am selling contraception to women who could potentially also be having abortions and not know it. And so I began to wonder if I had blood on my hands. And I didn't believe it, and I went home and I took out the FDA insert out of my birth control pills. Thought, this can't be true, and I pulled it out, and I opened it up, and I was reading and searching. And the print is so tiny that you have to get a magnifying glass out to read it. And I found it, and there it was in black and white. And then that's when I was really challenged, because I thought, hold on, this is true. I thought this was a lie. Why hasn't my doctor ever told me this? Why don't we tell women this at Planned Parenthood? Why hasn't anyone ever talked about this, ever? And that's what set everything in motion. Because God first converted my heart on that issue first. And I would later start to understand the connection of how that mentality has opened up the door to the abortion mentality, because it's a mentality that says no children. We don't want kids. And so I realized that in my own marriage, that's what my husband and I were saying. We don't want the gift of fertility, Lord. We don't want the children that you want to bless us with. And so I was challenged in that moment in a very, very deep way. And so when I returned back to my job, I was listening to Catholic radio on the way and on my way home, like to work and back. And I had about a 25 to 30 minute drive to and from. And it was like, whoa, wait a second. I was listening to things and hearing things that I'd never learned before about, euthanasia and the culture of life and the culture of death and all of these things about how Planned Parenthood is horrible and all the millions of babies that have perished. I had no idea. And of course, God's timing is perfect, because this was all going on during the month of January. And we know why now, because January is the month that we all head over to the March for Life in DC, and it's, that time of year, and it makes sense now why I was listening to, every time I turned on the radio, it was always something about being pro-life, right? And so during that whole time, I was listening to these things and just absorbing all of this new information and still trying to justify my job. And so I showed up at work, and I remember it was the end of January, and I had received a memo from our administrative office. And it was a memo about a retraining that was going to take place. If any of you remember, you may not remember, Live Action had put out some expose videos. And this was back in 2011. So this was January of 2011. You can go to Live Action's website and you can look them up. But this was a series of undercover investigative videos where a young man and a young woman, one disguised and acting as a pimp, and a young woman acting as a teenager, were going into Planned Parenthoods throughout the country. And it exposed Planned Parenthood workers willing to aid and abet in underage sex trafficking. But not only that, they were willing to cover it up so that this young woman could get an abortion. And they went, I think it was maybe 13 different clinics throughout several states. And in all of the undercover investigations, of all of those, I think only 2 actually reported the abuse. So as you can imagine, the president of PPFA at the time, Cecile Richards, she went out and did damage control, went to all of the big media outlets and things, and tried to convince the world that this was all made up and these videos were all doctored. But I was there when it happened, and I was there when they responded. So when I saw this memo and it said that we were all going to be retrained, and that's something that Cecile Richards said on national television. We're going to retrain all of our staff nationwide on how to identify this type of abuse and how to report this type of abuse. So I received the memo and I thought, oh great, see, Planned Parenthood's going to redeem themselves. They're not that bad after all. I'm still convinced. I still needed that job. And so I attended this so-called retraining. And so we were sitting in the exam room and there's this projector screen pulled down and they began to roll film. And they began rolling the film of the undercover investigative videos. So they finished that and then they move on to audio recordings. And in these audio recordings, they had captured people calling to Planned Parenthoods and asking if they could allocate money specifically to abort black babies. And the Planned Parenthood workers were saying, yes, we will take your money and apply it specifically to abort black babies. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to all of this and I'm thinking, wow, man, this is bad. I guess they're trying to show us what not to do, right? Before we get into the official training. And they stopped the videos and it ended, flipped on the lights, and she said, does anybody have any questions? And I looked around the room and I was looking at all the faces and I thought, gosh, no one has any questions. I do, I have a bunch, right? So I raised my hand and I said, I have a question. So I understand all of this, I get this, it's kind of like a what not to do. But what can I do as a clinic manager? Because, I need some sort of policies and procedures to take back to train the staff on what to do if this ever happens in my clinic. I don't want someone to come in and actually really be trafficking someone and not have a clue on what to do, right? Or how to report it. And she immediately shot me down and she said, Ramona, we're not here to discuss that. We're here to train you on how to identify if you're being videotaped or recorded. And I remember in that moment, it just was, that little emoji with the brain that blows up. That's how I felt. I mean, I couldn't believe, number one, that she actually said that out loud. And number two, my brain just kind of shut down. And as they were talking in the background, I thought, oh my God, everything they've said on the radio, everything that people have said about this organization is true. They're horrible. They're horrible. And they don't care about women. And you would think that the abortion component would be enough, right? But again, remember, in my mind, I'm still separate from that. And so it was like God was just kind of reaching me wherever it was that he could reach me first. And that was a big deal to me because I had been sexually abused in my previous marriage. And I never wanted anyone to ever go through that. And so for me, that was a big deal. And I had two daughters. My daughter and my stepdaughter were both teenagers. And I thought, I can never imagine my daughters going into a place like this where they would not protect them. And so I went back to my office and I thought, okay, I've got to get out of here. I started looking and Googling and putting my resume together, and I thought, Lord, please help me. Help me get out of here as soon as possible. And it was early February that I had heard an advertisement on Catholic radio about a group called 40 Days for Life that would come and hold a peaceful, prayerful vigil in front of the Sherman location. And I did a double take and I said, wait, what? Sherman, Texas? Why in the world would they come to Sherman, Texas? First of all, Sherman, Texas is a small city. For Texas, it's small. It's about 30,000 people. So you can imagine, Texas is huge. So 30,000 people is a small city for us. And I thought, okay, this doesn't make sense. Why on earth would they come to Sherman when there's Dallas, where the abortions are taking place, right? And I kept hearing this advertisement, over and over and over, 40 Days for Life, participate, they're going to kick off on Ash Wednesday, and blah, 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 and peaceful, prayerful vigil. And I thought, okay, they're going to be peaceful. We were one of the few locations that didn't do abortions where we had a presence outside of our clinic. And I always viewed them as crazy protesters, right? I'd actually had conversations with a couple of them once before, and they were always really judgmental. And I really didn't like them. I thought, oh, they're free to stand out there, but I don't like you. You know, they rubbed me wrong. And so when I heard that this vigil was going to take place, the thing that really struck me was, one, they were Christian. Two, just the idea that they were going to be peaceful. It put me at ease, because anytime there was a presence out there, I never knew what to expect. I never knew if those people were peaceful. I never knew if they were going to say something to me or, you know, intimidating or anything like that. I always worried, you know, what kind of people were out there. But this one was important because it just said they were peaceful and prayerful, and they would be standing in prayer for 40 days. And I thought, okay, well, that can't be bad, right? And the more that I heard it, the more I realized that God was sending me a sign. And somehow he had put it on my heart that I needed to go out and ask for their prayers. And it was on the third day of the campaign that inside of me I felt this stir, like, go out and pray. This is the day, Ramona. This is the day. You're going to go out and ask for prayers. And so I had hyped myself up all day. I thought, okay, this is the day. This is the day. And I walked out and I saw this woman on the sidewalk, and she looked at me and she waved and she smiled, and I looked and waved back, and I thought, oh, that's them. And I chickened out and I got in my car and I drove off. So it was about 2 blocks down the street when I realized I had forgotten the deposit. This was a Friday. And I tried to talk myself out of returning because I thought, oh, I have to run into that lady again. And I wasn't ready. And so I talked myself back into it because I thought I don't want to get in trouble and accused of stealing the money if, you know, something happens. So I went back and I got the deposit. And I walked back out, I looked over, she waved at me, I waved and smiled. I threw the deposit in the car, and I was getting ready to go, and then I thought, oh, I'm gonna get in my car. And then suddenly I felt like this push, like this little push, and this voice said, go. And suddenly I made this beeline right to her. And her eyes were as wide as saucers, because as you can imagine, you know, she knew I was coming out of Planned Parenthood, and you never know what you're gonna get, right? When the people approach you, you're kind of like, I don't know if I should be smiling or putting my fists up. And so I walked over to her and I said hi and I introduced myself and I asked her to pray for me. And I just assumed she was a 40 Days for Life volunteer. And I asked if she would pray for me, and she began to pray over me. And I realized very quickly, this isn't a Catholic woman. This is a Protestant woman, because I could tell by the way she was praying. But anyway, so she prayed over me. And in the moment that she's praying, we started talking, and this gentleman starts approaching me. He pulls up, very tall, bearded man, very masculine-looking man. And he starts walking. I kind of got uneasy because I didn't know who he was and why he was approaching me. And then he's just the most gentle, sweetest man ever. And he introduces himself as Jerry Brundage, who was the leader of that vigil. And the thing is, Jerry was supposed to be covering the 5 to 6 hour that day. But Jerry got caught up at work, and he couldn't leave. And this woman had never prayed in front of Planned Parenthood in her life. In her life. I found out later that God had put it on her heart to pray out there that day. And I realize now that maybe there was some sort of spiritual stuff going on, and maybe that's why Jerry was caught up late. But yet God filled in the gap with this woman who wasn't even part of the vigil. And she said yes, and she answered that call. And if she had not been there that day, no one would have been there that day. And I don't know if I would have ever mustered up the courage again to ask for prayers, but I did. And she was there and filled in that gap. And so Jerry and I began to talk. And he tells me he's the campaign leader, and I told him what was going on. And he said, Ramona, can we pray for you? Will you give me permission to give your information and share this with the team? Which was, for me, the biggest thing, because he was respecting my privacy. And I said, yes, I could use all the prayers I can get right now. And he said, hey, how about this? Would you be willing to give me your resume, and I can share it, and we can see if we can get you a job? And I was like, sure, absolutely. Anything you can do to help me. And for the next 40 days, I remember going into work, coming out, waving at the volunteers, going in, feeling like a new woman. I had been going to Mass every Sunday with my family. Everything seemed to be going well. I had this renewed sense of hope that I'm going to get out of here. And these people are going to help me, you know. But I could feel their prayers. It was the honest to God. That is the reason that I believe in the power of prayer today. Because of the power of prayer of those folks out on the sidewalk. You know, you truly are the hands and feet of Christ. You truly are Christ embodied, because we know God, we know He's real, but to see it in action, that's huge. And that's how I felt. I felt this unconditional love by complete and total strangers, right? Because typically when you think of people praying for you, it's usually your family and close friends. But to have strangers that don't know you, to dedicate their time, it's the greatest act of charity. To just love someone, and not just someone, but a sinner like me, who was working, you know, for Planned Parenthood, and here they are standing for life, and they're praying for me. And I felt those prayers. I kid you not, I felt them. Day in and day out, I felt those prayers. And I felt this closeness to God every day for those 40 days. I just kept growing closer and closer to God. Sadly, I was waiting for a job before I could leave, right? I thought, I can't leave here without a job. I can't leave here because we had just bought a house the year before. We needed my income to supplement his. And mine was just enough. And I thought, I can't leave here, Lord. Please help me out, right? So 40 days came and went, and I remember sitting at Mass on Easter Sunday with my family and thinking, wow, this is the end. You know, this is the end of not just Lent, but the end of the 40 Days for Life vigil, and I'm still at Planned Parenthood. Lord, I thought you were going to perform some miracle, right? Little did I know the miracle was happening the whole time. And I remember going back to work that Tuesday, because we didn't work on Mondays, we were closed. And I went back to work, and I just remember feeling kind of down and looking around and thinking, gosh, I'm still here, and these people are gone, you know? But they were still in touch with me. I had been in touch with Sean Carney and Lauren Musica, who was working for them at the time. Now she's the CEO of Sidewalk Advocates for Life. But so they were still in communication with me, but the volunteers were gone. And I felt sad. And I thought, what am I going to do without these people, right? And so I remember that Tuesday I left work, and it was the only time out of all of that time, and really in my life, that I had driven home in silence. No radio, nothing. It was just me and God for 25 minutes. And I remember just kind of shaking my fist at God and just asking the Lord, why have you abandoned me? Why have you abandoned me? Why am I still here? I should have a job by now. Why haven't you provided me a job? Why haven't you helped me find a way out of here, Lord? I've done everything right. I've done everything you've asked of me. Why am I still here? And he would give me the answer right away. I pulled into the driveway at my house, and I shut off the engine, and I flipped on the radio. And there was an elderly gentleman who had just called. When I turned on the radio, he just was calling in. And he was talking about his time in front of Planned Parenthood. At that point, it was like 35 years that he had been going out religiously to pray in front of the abortion facility in his town. And he's going on about, you know, the value and the dignity of the baby and how important it is for us to be in front and do something about the atrocity of abortion. And when he got done speaking, the radio host began to talk. And it was the moment that would transform me forever, for the rest of my life. Because it was no longer the radio host that was speaking to him, but God was speaking through her to me. And she said in that moment, in response to him, she said, thank you, good sir, for all that you've done for life. Thank you for being a witness for the unborn. Because you know, at the end of our lives, we're all going to stand before God. And he's going to ask you, did you know about abortion? He's going to ask you, did you know that babies were being ripped from their mother's wombs? Limb by limb, at the rate of over 3,000 a day. He's going to ask you, did you know? And what did you do? And when she finished that line, I began to sob uncontrollably. I was sobbing so uncontrollably, I had to hold myself up by the steering wheel. It was the moment that I realized it was this great mercy that God was pouring out to me. Because he wanted me to see. He wanted me to see that I had blood on my hands. No abortions weren't happening under my roof. But I was going to have to answer to God. Ramona, what did you do? I referred them. I told them where to go, Lord. That's what I was going to have to answer to God. And I began to sob and sob and sob. And I walked in my home, and my husband was frightened, as you can imagine, because I was crying uncontrollably. And the only words I could muster and say was, I'm going to hell. I'm going to hell. I'm going to hell. And he held me on the couch, and he hugged me, and he consoled me. And then I came to my senses, and I realized that God was just absolutely loving me in that moment. He needed me to see. He needed me to connect the dots. He needed me to understand what I had been involved in so that I could truly open my heart up to the mercy that he was pouring out to me. So I went back to work, and I thought, this is it. I can't be here any longer. God is saying, you have to leave, right? But Lord, how am I going to do this? I don't know how to do this, right? And I kept saying, okay, I'm going to leave at the end of the month. I'm going to leave at the end of the month. I just need a couple more paychecks to get some things organized, and I'm out of here, right? Well, I went back to Mass that Sunday, and we all who are Catholic know the Sunday after Easter Sunday is what? Divine Mercy Sunday. Divine Mercy Sunday. And for those of you who aren't Catholic, it's just a very beautiful feast day in our church where we celebrate Jesus' mercy, you know, just Jesus' mercy. May the 1st, 2011, that was the date. I was sitting in the pews with my family, and it wasn't just Divine Mercy Sunday, it was also the beatification day of St. John Paul II. Double whammy. So I'm sitting in the pews with my family, and during the consecration, I heard very clearly the words, Ramona, have faith in me, I forgive you. I had no idea the message of Divine Mercy Sunday. I had no idea about the words, Jesus, I trust in you, written on the bottom of that image. And yet I heard God speak to me saying, have faith in me. I forgive you. And it was all through that Mass that I heard from the readings to the hymns that God was speaking to me and reminding me to just take a leap of faith. Walk out. It was urgent now. I knew what I was doing. I knew what my involvement was at this point. I knew that I had blood on my hands, and God was saying, trust me. Trust me. So I remember walking out of Mass that day with my family and waking up Monday morning and thinking, this is it. I'm done. I am done. This for sure. You know, I decided. And I went back to work on Tuesday, and I thought, Lord, I'm leaving this Friday. Please help me. Help me get through these final days of Planned Parenthood. Just help me not to fall into sin. Protect me, Lord. And I showed up at work, and I received a phone call from admin telling me to cancel our schedule because our nurse practitioner had to be pulled to another location. We saw no patients, and I was there alone. Yeah, God's pretty amazing. It can't be outdone. So I called all of our patients and canceled them, and I got through that Tuesday. Wednesday came, and I said, Lord, please help me. Get me through today. He got me through Wednesday. I was off on Thursday. I went back on Friday, and I was there just feeling like a new woman because I knew that Friday was the day. And it was perfect because no one was there with me, and I was able to clear out my personal items and leave very quietly, and I was able to kind of never leave any sign behind that I was going to leave, so no one knew. And so on that Friday, I thought, oh, we just only have like an hour left, and I'm scot-free, right? I'm home free from after this. And a woman comes in, a young woman in her 20s, early 20s, and she wants a pregnancy test. And I looked at God like, really? On the bottom of the form, it asked, if your pregnancy test is positive today, what would you like? She had marked abortion, adoption, and prenatal because she was undecided and she didn't know what she wanted to do. And I thought, okay, Lord, I can work with this. And I took her back and I took her urine sample. And I didn't realize until just a few times ago that the way I ended my time at Planned Parenthood was the way I started, right? Only different. So I walked into the exam room and I congratulated her on her pregnancy. And she began to cry. And I thought, just Lord, give me the strength. Give me the words. I don't know what I'm going to say here, Lord, but just help me. Don't let me fall into this, right? Protect me from this. And I opened my mouth. Can't tell you exactly what came out. I remember just telling her and sharing my own experiences as a 16-year-old mother who had gone through so much. And I shared with her how God had brought me to the other side of that and brought someone into my life that would love me and love my daughter the way we were meant to be loved. And I shared my story with her, and she stood up and she threw her arms around my neck and she said, I'm keeping my baby.